So to start, let's ask a seemingly simple question, and that is, how does God do stuff? You may have noticed that for the most part in your life, you do not see a lot of examples of what we might call divine magic or God magic, right? So, for example, when someone's mean to you and you pray, God, give me justice, you rarely, if ever, maybe never have seen God shoot fire from the sky and consume that person and destroy them. That doesn't seem to be how God operates. And yet, I think if we were having a discussion and we could all just, hear about how God's worked in individual people's lives here, we would probably hear some interesting stories. We would probably hear about how God healed, maybe. We might hear about how God met in an ecstatic worship experience. We might hear that God redeemed someone from, say, an addiction or something that was holding them captive, a broken, sick relationship, something like that. We might note that God liberated somebody. Somebody was caught up in, whatever, and God miraculously brought freedom. And maybe that came through other people. Maybe it came through a reading of the Word, through preaching, through worship, something like that. Even just an epiphany during prayer. I mean, who knows? But we would find that most Christians would say that God, does stuff, right? But there does seem to be a weird disconnect between the story of Elijah being the prophets of Baal, and Elijah's God, and then God sends down fire and blows up the altar, and then they douse the sacrifices with water, and God consumes everything again. We just don't see a lot of that. And so it's worth asking, okay, we'll just, for the sake of argument, of course God could, but God doesn't seem to do that very often. Instead, God seems to act in other ways, right? So what is it that God's doing? How is it possible that we can say that God is, in fact, acting, even though we don't see these massive interventions, right? How is it that God can be involved in the world without just randomly suspending the laws of everything and just acting in random weird ways? Well, I think that there's two ways to get at this problem. The first is we need to think Trinitarianly. Okay, when we say that God does things, it seems to me that we're actually talking about something that God does through Father, Son, and Spirit. So, for example, let's say that someone experiences healing. Okay, let's say you think that's possible, and you think that someone that maybe you have experienced divine healing. How would you say that took place? What happened? Well, we would say probably that the Father willed you to be healed, right? That God had a desire in some way for your healing. In a way, maybe that God, for whatever reason, didn't for somebody else. Because we've all known someone who prayed for healing and didn't get it, and that happens a lot. But occasionally, it seems as though, and I've seen this in my own congregation, it seems as though God does something tremendous. And so presumably, what's going on there is that wherever God's at, God's saying, the Father is saying, I want this, right? But how's it going to get done? Right? How's it going to get done? Well, I think it's going to get done Christly. Christly meaning that, whatever God's going to do, when God acts in the world, God acts in a, Christ-like way. And maybe that's putting it backwards, because we might want to say, well, Jesus is acting in a God-like way. But the point is that whatever we see of Jesus' nature and character, the way Jesus operates, is that's going to be something that characterizes the way God acts in our lives. So, for example, when you look at Jesus' healings in the New Testament, typically Jesus' healings are a communal event, right? Jesus isn't just helping out one person. So, for example, the widow of Nain, right? When Jesus raises her son from the dead, says, "Go to your mother." Right? Sends the son to his mother, and that's of course because in the ancient world, if you were a widow and your only son died, you would have no way to support yourself, and so the death of the son was effectively putting the widow of Nain into poverty and death herself. And so when Jesus raises the son from the dead, Jesus is healing the son from death, but Jesus is doing so in a way to benefit the son's mother. And you can go through almost any example of Jesus healing. There's always a sense in which the healing is not just for the person being healed, it's for the family, it's for the community. And so there's a way in which the healings that Jesus provides are nourishing and vital for the religious life, the spiritual life of those around Jesus. And so when we see actual healings in life, they tend to be done Christly. The healing is not just so that so-and-so doesn't die of cancer, it's so that so-and-so is restored to a community that badly needs so-and-so. And then, as with everything Jesus does, God gets the glory for it, right? So, because it's Christly, it leads to glory for the Father. Because everything that Jesus does ends up causing glory to God. And we see this in the Old Testament as well. Like anytime there's a healing in the Psalms, right? The psalmist always says, "And I will glorify you in the company. I will go to the temple and I'll tell of your wondrous deeds," right? And so, because Jesus is a Father glorifier, any healing that's God the Father does or wills is going to be done Christly, leading to God's glory. But also, it has to be done in the here and now. And so, when we talk about the Godhead, we talk about the Spirit being, immanent to the world, right? And if you remember the term panentheism from a week or two ago, we think of the Spirit being in and through all here, but at the same time, eternally united to the Father. And so the Spirit mediates the divine presence to the world here. And so when we say that you were healed in the power of the Spirit in a Christly way that leads to the glory of the Father. It's a Trinitarian explanation. It actually has some interesting implications too. How does the Spirit do it, right? What is the Spirit doing? Well, I think when we say that the Spirit is immanent to the created order, we say that the Spirit is working in and through created the processes of the created order to effect the will of God. And this is an exceedingly complex way of going about things, and I honestly think that it helps us if we start to think about things in terms of modern physics. We start to recognize the impact of special and general relativity. We start to think about the importance of the possibility that the world is open, and that there's such a thing as quantum indeterminacy, and that preference cascades are real, and there is, we can suggest that we can come up with percentages for possibilities of outcomes, but that the future really is open, and somehow it's the Spirit in the middle of these subatomic processes, these quantum events that kind of nudges things to go one way or the other. And so we could say then that the Spirit is not, in general, not subverting natural processes, but kind of nudging natural processes in a particular direction. And this might actually kind of accord with our actual experience of healings, right? In general, healings take time. They're not necessarily instantaneous, sometimes, but rarely. They're often surprising. They often seem to be in conjunction with medical care, sometimes outside of it, sometimes not quite sure what the relationship is between medical care and the healings that we receive. It seems as though, it doesn't seem like the natural laws of physics are being violated, right? It doesn't seem like there's divine fire coming from the sky and destroying your tumor. And yet it does seem like sometimes these tumors just go away and no one understands exactly how or why. And sometimes this is in conjunction with prayer. Sometimes it's in conjunction with laying on of hands. Sometimes there's a lot of different factors going on. We're not quite exactly sure how it is that the Spirit is moving through, but it doesn't seem like the Spirit's just violating laws of physics willy-nilly. Instead, maybe it's the case that physics itself is somehow an open system, and that there is room for possibility and creativity and a sort of a nudging towards life. Right? And that might be a constructive way to talk about divine action in a way that is comfortable for modern science, and yet is also deeply Trinitarian and Orthodox. And if you buy that, then you can start to look at any example of divine action, and you can start to look for the roles of the Godhead and how it is that this divine action is in keeping with who God is in God's self. And so one of the things that we can say about God in God's self is God is a redeeming God. And God doesn't need a creation to be redeeming. That God is in God's self a redeeming, liberating God. That part of what it is to be God is to be out bringing about fresh life. And this is maybe one of the reasons we have a creation, right? God is out there and there's nothingness, right? And God redeems nothingness into the created order. And when the created order is fallen, God redeems that fallen order through, in a Christly way, in the power of the Spirit, through self-giving love. And then that all results in glory to the Father. And so divine action leads to an implication, a Trinitarian implication. The economic example of God's healing can show us something that we can say about who God is, and that God, even apart from, well, the natural result of God being a redeeming God means that there is creation. God is a creating God because God is a redeeming God.